The hippies were just the name of the group of people during the 60s who kind of were disillusioned to the movements that were going on in the 60s, and they wanted to break away from society and the social norms that were going on. They wanted to find a way to find their own freedom and individuality, get to a higher life. They wanted to transcend everybody else through living in simplicity, which means no iPhones. They began to turn to drugs as more of a recreational use, like using marijuana and LSD as kind of an escape. And they loosened social connotations on sexual relationships. Another part that contributed to the use of sexual relationships was the founding of Margaret Sanger. She developed a birth control pill that kind of allowed women to be able to have sexual relationships without worrying about getting pregnant. This is an era when gays started to make more of a profound appearance, and they began to protest for their rights, and instead of just hiding like they used to away from social norms, they began to more prominently make a statement about themselves, being inspired by the individuality that youth movements and free speech movements had given them. From their appearance, you could easily tell hippies from I guess what you would call normal people. But they would usually have like more revealing clothing or bright clothing. They probably had a bunch of peace signs everywhere, the tie-dye shirts and everything. Some of them would grow out their hair, some could grow them out to become afros, which probably looked really chill. And others grew out their hair really long, which probably meant that you couldn't tell guys from girls, but you know how it goes. One of the reasons that hippies wanted to break away from the norms of society was because of the growing generation gap. Like, the youth had more of separate identity from the older generation. They became part of the new left and the counterculture. Most of the movements were made up of student activists. The media played a big role in the 60s era. There was a proliferation of newspapers, radio, television. The news that they showed was a lot more explicit in order to elicit a stronger response to the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the different social movements that were going on. Television had a huge part in it because it was a brand new type of technology and people were extremely interested in it. Books also played a huge role in spreading ideas throughout the 60s. Betty Friedan, she wrote The Feminine Mystique about the social oppressions that women go through, advocating for women's rights. Rachel Carson wrote The Silent Spring, which was a major turning point in the environmentalist movement. It inspired a lot of scientific and moral support for the environmentalists. Harper Lee wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, which was a representation of society's oppressions on blacks, and she advocated equality for blacks and whites. Music also played a prominent role in changing society. There was a new movement in rock and roll. There was a lot of movement towards more jazzy music. A lot of this was based on like old African American folk music. In 1969, there was a musical convention at Woodstock in New York. The slogan for Woodstock was 3 days of peace and music. It was a peace movement led by students, mostly hippies, against the Vietnam War. There was a lot of music, including rock and roll and jazz, but probably more rock and roll from what I read in my textbook.
So my topic is the Cold War during the 60s. So far, the US approach to communism was containment, which was basically containing communism until it died out. John Dulles, the Secretary of State, thought that this was way too passive, so he decided to try something called brinkmanship. This ideology was to basically push change on communist countries using bomb threats. This made the United States more offensive in their approach to communism. On the other side, things were going great for communists. France lost Vietnam, the USSR crushed a pro-democratic uprising in Hungary, and the Cuban Communist Revolution succeeded. Things changed in the US too. Eisenhower was no longer president and JFK took his place. Immediately entering the presidency, John F. Kennedy had to deal with this whole plan that Eisenhower had been hatching up during the presidency. The U.S. had been supporting the training of a bunch of Cuban exiles that had a plan to overthrow Fidel Castro in communist Cuba. The U.S. in turn was going to support the rebellion with our Air Force. At the last minute, JFK revoked the promise and gave the exiles no support. On April 17, 1961, the exiles landed in the Bay of Pigs with no U.S. support. I'm sure you can guess what happened next. As you can imagine, Castro didn't really like the idea of a U.S. invasion, so he agreed to let the Soviets put missiles on their island. They were pointed straight at the United States with a range far enough to hit the capital. And thus the Cuban Missile Crisis was born. JFK and the U.S. citizens were incredibly panicked, so JFK immediately staged a naval and air blockade of Cuba, and then announced that any missile launched from Cuba would result in a full-scale United States attack. After a nerve-wracking 14 days, Khrushchev and JFK reached an agreement that the Soviets would remove their missiles if the U.S. promised not to attack Cuba and took down their missiles in Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the climax of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and tensions began to decrease following this crisis.
In the 1960s, the two major world powers, the US and the Soviet Union, began to compete to see who could get into space first. It started on October 4th, 1957, when the Soviets successfully launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into space. When the Soviets released Sputnik 1, the USA felt the need to protect national security and Soviet control of space. After some funds were given, the US went into full-on space mode. This later led to the Star Wars space program of the 80s. President Eisenhower created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, in order to develop aeronautics and aerospace research. When President Kennedy became in charge, he announced the goal to send man to the moon. This was a huge idea, yet the public eagerly followed it. The Soviets tried to beat us and launched the first man into space, and he orbited for 108 minutes. When the USA finally launched into the sky, Alan Shepard remained in space for only 15 minutes. This did not impress the Soviets. On February 3rd, the Soviets had the first unmanned lunar landing on the moon, the Luna 9. The USA felt like they were coming in second, so they went ahead and launched several attempts of man on the moon, but they all failed. On July 16, 1969, the USA sent the winning ship into the sky. Apollo 11 reached the moon, man walked on the surface. The USA had won the race.
In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education overturns the Plessy v. Ferguson decision. The decision declared separate public schools for students to be unconstitutional.
On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat at the front of the bus. The effect of her refusal sparked the Montgomery boycott movement.
In 1956, MLK, Charles K. Steele, and Fred C. Shuttlesworth established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
In September of 1957, 9 black students attended an all-white high school in Little Rock High School in Arkansas.
April 1960, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is founded at Shaw University, which provided the younger African American generation a place in the civil rights movement.
In 1961, civil rights activists known as Freedom Riders rode interstate buses into the segregated southern U.S. areas.
In 1963, MLK is arrested and jailed during anti-segregation protests in Alabama. In jail, he wrote the letter from Birmingham jail, arguing that individuals have the moral duty to disobey unjust laws.
In May of 1963, Commissioner of Public Safety Bull Connor uses fire hoses and police dogs on black demonstrators. These images are televised and are instrumental in gaining sympathy and support for the movement.
On August 20th, 1963, 200,000 people joined the March on Washington, and MLK delivers his famous I Have a Dream speech.
On January 23, 1964, the 24th Amendment abolishes the poll tax.
July 2nd, 1964, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits all types of segregation of any kind based on color, religion, race, or origin.
And on April 11, 1968, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which provided for equal housing opportunities for all race, religion, and origin of people. The Vietnam War occurred from 1955 to 1975. In 1960, VietCon was formed, also known as the National Liberation Front for South Vietnam.
In 1962, America's first combat mission against VitCon occurred, called Operation Chopper. In 1963, Buddhist monks start setting themselves on fire in public places to protest against the Diem government policy of removing Buddhists from key government positions and replacing them with Catholics. Diem and his brother are murdered. The Diem regime is overthrown. In 1964, 3 North Vietnamese PT boats allegedly fire torpedoes at the USS Maddox. This incident is known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Also in 1964, the U.S. wages total war against North Vietnam. In 1965, over 200,000 U.S. troops are sent to Vietnam. In February of 1965, bombing raids on North Vietnam commence, referred to as Operation Rolling Thunder. The air raids continue for 3 years. In 1965, students at American universities start to strongly protest against the U.S. policy in Vietnam. In 1968, the Tet Offensive occurs. The Viet Cong scores a psychological victory. Also in 1968, the My Lai village massacre by U.S. troops occurs. Peace talks take place in Paris between the North Vietnamese and the Americans. In 1969, Ho Chi Minh dies. In 1970, there is a tragedy at Ohio. National Guardsmen opened fire on protesting students at Kent State University. By 1973, all remaining U.S. troops have left Vietnam.